Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Herbin Bleu Myosotis. I'll be testing Blue Myosotis on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Blue Myosotis to similar blue inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Herbin Bleu Myosotis felt a little dry in my glass dip nib, but it came off the nib nice and uniformly. The swatch that I made using tweezers had a little bit of trouble holding on to the paper. The range of shades that I'm seeing in this swatch gives me a hint that I might see some nice shading in some nibs. I'm not seeing any sheen on this drip at the end of the swatch, but I am seeing a slight halo of darker ink. I'm going to begin with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. On this smooth Tomoe River paper, this extra fine nib, I'm going to go ahead and say that it felt smooth. This ink is on the borderline of being not dark enough to use in this fine of a nib, at least for my taste. But on this paper, with these small grids, it looks very nice. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Lucina. It has a stainless steel fine nib. This nib is noticeably wider than the Kakuno Extra Fine, but it's wetter than the Kakuno. It's putting down more ink, but it's still a little bit too pale for my taste in this fine of a nib. So for a nib this size, yeah, I'll say it's smooth. At least on this paper. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Just a hint wetter than the first two nibs, but that's just enough to make this nib much more enjoyable to me. It's just slightly darker, and that is just enough to make me enjoy this nib much more than the first two. Next, I've got a Pilot Explorer. It has a stainless steel medium nib. I'm feeling more drag on the paper. I wouldn't call it feedback. It feels like the nib is dry and there's just more drag. It's like I'm writing with an eraser. It's not scratchy. It just wants to stick to the paper, if that makes sense. So I would call this smooth but dry. It's almost like that feeling you get when you write a pen completely dry and it goes from being really smooth to that moment when you run out of ink, you can feel it. But as you can see, I'm not running out of ink. It's almost as wet as the grants, but I guess just because it's being spread out over a wider line, it makes it feel drier. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Slightly wetter than the previous two nibs, and see how this is, it's putting down more ink and it's smooth, but there's something about these Pilot medium nibs that with certain inks, it drags the ink and the ink wants to pull up at the end of the stroke that you're making. And with some inks, I think that it looks nice, but something about this ink, I'm just not liking the way it looks. It makes my writing, or it makes the ink look blobby. I'm not as fond of it in this one, but it is, yeah, I would call that smooth. Next, I'll be writing with the Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat hard medium nib. This Sailor nib is just as wet as the Pilot 14 karat medium nib, but you see how it distributes the ink differently. It spreads the ink out more uniformly. I'm still getting a little bit of shading and it looks very nice, but it's not blobby like the Pilot medium nib. And I like having both of these medium nibs in my collection because some inks look better in this Pilot nib, but this is one of those inks. They tend to be the lighter, less saturated inks that I feel like they look better in the Sailor medium nib. And that would be the same. The Sailor medium nib and the Platinum medium nibs, I think, handle these type of inks better than the Pilot does. Now, I wouldn't call this one smooth, but it is very nice. I'm starting to feel a little feedback in this one, but it is very nice. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This nib is nice and wet, but not too wet. The letters don't look blobby, but I'm getting some nice shading. I would enjoy this nib and ink combination for letter writing, I believe. And on this paper it is very smooth. And finally, I'll be writing with my Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. This ink looks very nice on this paper. I'm seeing some nice subtle shading, and the writing experience was very smooth. I would almost call it slippery, like writing on glass. Not exactly my favorite. I don't have the control that I like. Lots of inks tend to feel very luxurious in this nib, but this ink just feels very watery. But it does look good. While this dries, let's take a look at some other writing samples. On my Rhodia swatch, you can really see the range of shades you get in the swatch. All of these nibs felt dry, not necessarily unpleasant, maybe on the borderline. And part of that is I'm kind of spoiled by the ink that I'm using for my everyday writing right now. It's a very saturated, luxurious feeling ink. So this was my first writing sample that I did, so I'm kind of having to get used to being able to feel the paper. The Sailor, I was really looking forward to writing with this ink in the Sailor nib. Unfortunately, on this paper, it felt very dry. I don't think I would be able to do lengthy writing with this nib and ink combination, at least on this paper. I think I would just get tired of that amount of feedback. And then when I switched to the Pilot Custom Heritage, that's also a 14 karat medium nib, look at the difference in the wetness. And it was too wet. The Pilot Explorer was a little bit dry, quite a bit drier, but just felt a little too glassy smooth. The Pilot Grants was getting on the borderline of having too much feedback. And then the Lucina and the Kakuno were, borderline too much feedback. I've done ink tests before where I would do a writing sample on one type of paper and then go to do a writing sample on another type, and I dreaded it because it was so unpleasant. I wouldn't classify these as unpleasant, maybe more like not as enjoyable as some of my other ink choices are. As usual, on copy paper, this ink just looks a little flat. You see a little bit of shading, but this copy paper really flattens it out. Now, the Kaweco and the Pilot Explorer kind of stood out as feeling a little bit nicer than the Rhodia writing sample did, which that kind of surprised me. This is a lighter ink, so I'm not seeing much showing through. In my old Leuchtturm bullet journal, Bleu Myosotis has some nice subtle shading, and I liked the feel of that stub nib on this kind of chalky Leuchtturm paper. I liked it a bit more than the other writing samples that I've done so far. I've got one more writing sample that I want to show. The reason I chose Bleu Myosotis to test first is I was wanting an ink that kind of matched my Filofax clipbook, and Bleu Myosotis is a nice match. I did my first writing sample, and I left some of the pens out, like the Kakuno and the 1.5 Stub, because those aren't pens that I would be using for note-taking in this notebook. But I went through all of them, and I just wasn't really crazy about any of them, except the Kaweco. The Kaweco broad was really nice, but I don't really want to use a broad in this notebook for note-taking. It just feels a little cramped to me. So I did one more writing sample on some plain paper. These are both the Filofax paper that came in this notebook, and I picked out the two that had the best chance, and I did one more writing sample with the Pilot Grants and the Sailor 1911, and I liked both of them. Once you kind of separate it out and you're not comparing one nib to another nib, you're just thinking about, that one nib. Would I like to write an entire page of notes, a page or two of notes with this nib? These two, I could see myself doing that. Now, the pen I'm going to choose, neither one is matchy-matchy, but I just like the look of the Grants with this notebook. It's got the silver trim, and I've got the silver rings here, and it's kind of blue, not an exact match. But I tested it, and whenever I'm using this clipbook, I keep the pen I'm using here in the spine, and it fits nicely. My only concern, and I'm going to have to watch this, is this Grants, and in fact, this isn't the only Grants that behaves like this. I have another Grants with a medium nib. The cap comes off pretty easily. But then to snap it on, you have to give it a little bit more force. I wish it was the other way around. I wish it took more force to remove the cap and then a little bit less force to put it back on, but we'll see if the pen stays together when I have it here in my notebook. I'm pretty careful with it. I'm aware of the fact that, you know, I've always got a fountain pen in this spine, so I'm pretty careful with it. I always hold it horizontally when I'm carrying it, so it should be fine, but it is something to keep an eye on. When I started looking for similar inks to Herbin Bleu Myosotis, I don't really have anything that is very close. The closest thing I have is Noodler's Kung De Chang, and it's similar in color, very similar in color, but behaves very differently. You can see here, Kung De Chang wants to spread on the nib. See how wispy and crisp the dip nib scribble was compared to the dip nib scribble over here. And there's not quite as much shading on Kung De Chang as there is in Bleu Myosotis. Now, Bleu Myosotis does perform better in wider nibs, whereas Kung De Chang, since it spreads so bad, does really well in extra fine nibs. Shinkai, just looking at the swatch, there's some similarity, but this has more possibly black in it. It's much darker. But as you get into the wetter nibs, they get closer and closer in appearance. Diatramentis Sherlock Holmes, again, there's some similarity, but it doesn't get as light as Bleu Myosotis. And I can't remember, Sherlock Holmes is like another name for the regular name of this ink, and I'll put it up on the screen. It's something like Midnight Blue or Night Blue, something like that. So that would be, it would look similar in some nibs, but in drier nibs, this would be much darker. Serenity Blue is better behaved in a wider range of nibs than Bleu Myosotis, and Serenity Blue is also a much brighter blue. This has more of a powder blue look to it. And Waterman Mysterious Blue looks like it might lean a little bit more toward the teal side, whereas Bleu Myosotis leans a little bit more blurpily. Again, this Waterman ink performs better in a wider range of nibs, and I've used this ink before in a Pilot Explorer with my Filofax clipped book, and I liked it on that paper very much. I was hoping that Herbin Bleu Myosotis would have some water resistance, and it did. When I submerged it in the water for 10 minutes, I couldn't really see any ink coming off the page, but I know some did. So that tells me there are more than one component to this ink. Possibly, maybe some of the purple came up and we're left with just this light blue, but what got left behind is very crisp and very legible. You can see the swatch tests that I did for all the Herbin inks in my collection, and Herbin Bleu Myosotis was one of the inks that didn't have any trouble with bleed through or anything like that on the page. But just to be sure, let's check the back of this one. Yeah, we put down some ink pretty heavily in some places, but no bleed through, and not a lot of show through because this ink is kind of lighter in color. Some nice shading. I like the shading that I got in the Kaweco. It's not as blobby or sloppy looking as the shading that I got in the Custom Heritage 91. Actually, and the 1.5 stub nib was even more subtle than the shading that I saw in the Kaweco, but I'm really liking the Kaweco. And I really liked this Sailor 1911 on this nice, smooth Tomoe River paper. As far as very fine nibs go, I liked the Grants. So the trick with this ink is to find a nib that puts down plenty of ink to give you some lubrication on that nib, but not too much ink to make it look sloppy. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.